Good afternoon, Masal Khair. Welcome to the Carnegie Middle East Center. Today's session is with an old friend, Wissam Yafi, who I saw 10 years ago. And I wish he had told me then that democracy was inevitable in the Arab world. We would have saved a lot of worries along the way. But I'm very, very glad to welcome him back to Beirut and to welcome him to the Carnegie Center. Wissam is, as the bio suggests, works in the technology field, sort of a technologist. He studied at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is currently an international development Harvard scholar. He's also the chairman in Washington of the Middle East and North Africa Democracy Group, which is an NGO, works on democracy issues. And he's also a writer and researcher. And the book that he's here to tell us about today is called Inevitable Democracy in the Arab World, New Realities in an Ancient Land. And it looks at the geopolitics, geo-economics, the geosocial dynamics, and technology aspects of change that's been taking place, and I suppose how to look at the future given these dynamics. This book will be available very soon as a download. Either you can order it on Amazon. In your handouts is some information about that, or can be acquired as an ebook. I think in the next couple of weeks should be made available. Wissam, without further ado, let's go into your presentation. I know you have an interesting and rather elaborate PowerPoint presentation. So let's try to go through that fairly quickly and then get to a discussion session. And thanks again for coming and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's very nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's always nice to be back home. For the guys filming in the back, can I stand up or should I be seated?
You can stand up, you're fine.
I can stand up. It's a little bit more. Okay. So thank you very much for, I guess, your interest in this topic. This is something that's, I guess, the product of several years. I started writing this book back in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And by 2005, 2006, it was ready for publishing. But I guess at the time it was very difficult to sell this concept to a lot of people. They didn't believe that it's about to happen, or at least the reasons behind it. So what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about the hypothesis of where the book basically, or on what it bases its argument. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of delve into some of the concepts of, I guess, the controversial aspect of it, which is the inevitability of democracy, and some of the things going forward. And I hope this will be an open conversation, so I'm looking forward to Paul's moderation once we're done with some of the slides, and of course with your feedback and an open discussion. So the basic hypothesis, just if we start with what the book is really about, it's really about dynamics. This isn't a technical book. This is really a book meant to be read by anyone. And it bases the argument on four primary factors. The first one being geopolitical, second one being geoeconomic, geosocial, and technological. And it builds the case on these four dynamics, or these four primary factors. Now this framework is such because the problem is holistic in its nature. And if anybody tries to resolve or come up with suggestions based on any one of these, and many have over the past few decades, it's incomplete. So somebody might look at the problem right now and maybe come up with some geopolitical explanations. It doesn't explain the whole picture. The geoeconomics and the geosocial aspects the same. So a lot of the suggestions that the World Bank, IMF, a lot of NGOs that may or may not have had any specific political agendas on their own, they came up with a lot of suggestions. But of course, it was not seen necessarily from a holistic perspective. And of course, there's the technological aspect, which is very close to my heart because I am a technologist at the end of the day. So we're going to go very quickly over each one of these. And hopefully I'll be able to share with you a lot of the cases. Now the book looks at the Arab world and takes several examples and cases. But it also looks at the world and what has been happening over the past few decades. We look at Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, looked at South Asia. So we're not alone. And that's good news, I suppose, in many ways. So let me go ahead and start. The key questions that are answered by the book are four, which is what is happening right now, which many of us know. Why is it happening, and why is it happening now? And this is an important question, because when somebody tries to explain a dynamic, then the now or the timing becomes of essence. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And where is it heading in the future? So are the dynamics going in a positive direction or in a negative one? And finally, what to do about it. And that's really from a policy perspective, particularly when it comes to regional policies, but also international ones. So let's delve into the first one, the geopolitics. Now the geopolitics, the book, what it looks at is several aspects of it. And we can't delve, obviously, for the limitations of time in all of them. But it looks at the Cold War, it looks at things like Middle Eastern oil and its effects on the geopolitical dynamics. Globalization, which is a very important, I guess, factor that has been affecting everybody, including our region. Terrorism, the invasion. There's some people in the United States that would like to sell the argument that the Iraqi invasion was really the reason why this is all happening. So is that is this a true statement or is it a myth? So we also kind of looked at that. And obviously the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as well. So if we look at a summary of where we were before 2003 and the invasion, what we see is there were some kind of, I guess you can call them imperfect democracies. At least, in Lebanon we can be proud of one democracy, as imperfect as it may be. In the US and in Israel, they like to boast that Israel is another democracy. And there were some experiments happening in Algeria, but that were opposed actually in the early 1990s. And some initiatives here and there, but there was really nothing that was happening that one could point to as being, kind of like a region-wide geopolitical movement. So we had the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and everybody knows what happened in those, or at least through those, I guess, unfortunate circumstances. This was triggered mostly by 9/11. In the book, we argue that the relationship is not necessarily that one caused the other, but there is, in other words, the causality is not direct, and it might not have been perpetrated by Iraq, but there is a definite relationship in terms of the series of events that happened. And then we had the Cedar Revolution here in Lebanon. Now this is a very interesting case, because some of the people or the readings out there with respect to the Cedar Revolution attribute it to maybe some economic, etc. And there might be certain truth to that because of the shortfalls, the economic kind of meltdowns that happened after the what occurred, for example, with the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, etc. But it doesn't really explain it. And one very interesting kind of indication was what occurred in Washington. I live in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. And you started seeing Lebanese politicians actually going to Washington, D.C. And I wondered at the time, I guess prime ministers, but also MPs. We started seeing MPs in Washington, D.C. And that kind of led, I think, the House Speaker, who's known for a certain sense of humor, to say, we needed cars, now we need planes. So that was very interesting. But what it did point was to the fact that this was a geopolitical movement. So essentially, the Lebanese politics saw in what happened in Iraq an opportunity to approach the United States and kind of ride that wave. But that was it. There wasn't really all that much else going on. We did see something happening to a light degree in the Palestinian territories. But for the most part, these movements stayed around Beirut, stayed around maybe the Palestinian territories, and definitely in Iraq. So what explains everything that happened as of 2011, which is, all these movements all of a sudden happened? If somebody tries to sell the concept of it was caused by, for example, what occurred in Iraq, perhaps there was an effect, there was some kind of relationship, but it wasn't direct and it wasn't immediate. So why did it have to wait 6 years or whatever number of years for it to occur? This, alongside other explanations, point to the fact that there's much more than just geopolitics happening in the region. So, is geopolitics the whole story? Is a point argued in the book. Could it on its own have moved the entire region? And it's interesting to see where some of these movements within the region occurred. for example, Dara in Syria. Now, this is a backwater town that's in the middle of nowhere. Things like Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. I mean, that's, again, it's a landlocked, it's not near the capital. Usually, most of the, if you look at history, particularly Latin American history is of interest, because there's a lot of coups d'etats, etc., or at least in their history. You see a lot of the coups d'etats occurring near the capitals. So in Caracas, Venezuela, the attempted coup by Chavez at the time occurred in Caracas. Things that happened in Ecuador, they occur in Quito. So why is it that these movements occurred in really backwater areas that have nothing to do with, direct coup d'etat attempts, and why? So again, it points to things happening that do not have a purely geopolitical aspect. The question of why did it not happen before, and how much of it was caused externally, which was an interesting question that was posed the other day by a friend, which is, without actually knowing the entire contents of the book, he outright asked me, do you actually believe what's happening is region or generated from within the region, or is it just somebody playing on the outside? So we start looking at the other factors, and once you start looking at the other factors, there's a lot more stuff that comes out. So the geoeconomic situation over the past decade or two is very interesting to look at. In this case, we looked at the book at three particular elements or sub-factors: human development, productivity and growth, and competitiveness. And there's very good news on that front. For example, very impressive human development improvements within our region. In fact, if you compare our region to places like Latin America, like Africa, Southeast Asia, lesser developed nations, the jump within our region when it comes to human development, which includes a whole lot of other sub-factors, things like education, life expectancy, things like urbanization, a lot of the stuff that really improve the quality of life, then the Arab region actually saw the biggest jumps. Which is interesting, because if you would expect, if people are more educated, for example, if we look at the literacy rates and we compare them against some of the other regions around, the literacy rates in our region have really gone up. Great news for men, for women, especially for the young folks. The youth literacy is very high. Illiteracy is going down, and that's fantastic. And in the book, we really debunk some of the myths, which is our region is not educated enough to be democratic, etc. So one of the cases we actually looked at was India. India in 1950 had 85% illiteracy. 85% of the people did not know how to read and write. And still they implemented democracy, and it worked. India right now is the largest democracy in the world. The United States, back in the 1700s, was not a very literate nation. It's not as it is today. So we do some literacy studies, etc. And we found that literacy-wide, the region is doing great. People are more educated. And yet, if we look at the economic situation, there's a lot of stagnation. And a lot of the banks and organizations and NGOs, I'm sure Paul is very familiar with that, they would come up with studies and say, hey guys, there needs to be more done. Populations are growing, but the economies are not growing. So what's typically referred to as an endowment, which is large populations, such as is the case in Indonesia and Brazil right now. Large populations, all working hard, all producing, growing the economies. This did not occur in the region. Why? So you see the richest, the wealthiest nation in our region, which is Saudi Arabia, you would expect it to be doing well. In fact, the per capita GDP is going down. In other words, the future generations are poorer than previous ones. And if you do a very simple comparison, the overall economy right now is at about 500 billion nominal. Take out the oil exports, and the true economy is only about 200 billion, which is about Singapore's size. Singapore is a very small city-state. It's not even a nation. Doesn't have any resources, and yet they're very productive. In fact, on a per capita basis, a typical Singaporean exports about $33,000 a year, whereas a typical Arab exports about $100 a year. So why is that? There was a very interesting study done by a colleague and actually a previous professor. His name is Lance Pritchett. He used to work at the World Bank and at Harvard. And what he found was comparing the MENA region with East Asia is that productivity, even though education was going up, productivity was going down. people at the micro level. At the micro level. And this is really the key. In a recent booklet that I read, I'm not sure if Paul saw this, by our previous Prime Minister, Fuad Signora, he wrote a small booklet, a policy kind of paper, about the Arab uprisings and etc. It was interesting. But he focused on similar dynamics, but his economic focus was at the macro level. The problem within the Arab world is not at the macro level, it's at the micro level. People at the micro level are not productive enough. So what this gentleman saw is taking it over a 20-year period is productivity of people going down. The main reason for this, without going into too much detail, is because the only way that people were getting jobs is to enter the government sectors. The case of Egypt. So you had a government sector in Egypt almost double the size of the federal sector in the United States, with about, what, a 30th of the economic size. That's a big problem. So this resulted in massive unemployment. And you saw things in Tunisia, obviously, that became a hot zone. Tunisia is interesting because in 2008, the labor ministry in Tunisia came up with a report. They studied their labor, what was going on inside of Tunisia. And their recommendations, or at least their diagnosis of the problem, was clear. They knew what was going on, but they could not do anything about it. So we ended up with 2010, the Sidi Bouzid revolt. Now the Sidi Bouzid revolt, if somebody tries to tell me this was a geopolitical move, it's not convincing. Just because there was an invasion in Iraq, all of a sudden Sidi Bouzid, which is a small town in the middle of nowhere in Tunisia, is all of a sudden going to revolt. Difficult to sell. But these are interesting statistics that are more convincing. For example, number of young unemployed graduates nearly doubled in 10 years. 336,000 graduates don't have jobs. 46% of young graduates did not have a job 18 months after graduation. They were doing nothing. So they talk about Facebook. They were doing Facebook maybe. Nearly 50% of master's graduates and graduates with advanced technical diplomas did not have jobs, etc., etc. And you guys know what happened. It was swift, it was quick, it was emotional. There were people out on the streets. Ben Ali skipped town. Did Ben Ali skip town because he felt it was time to retire? Did he skip town because he felt he could beat them? He skipped town because he knew that there was no way to beat him. Let's jump to the third, which is geosocial. So the geosocial, this is a very interesting one. We actually delved into these factors of demographics, mobility of people, role of women. Islam was an interesting subject that we tackled too. Very, very briefly, the demographic explosion is, I would call it almost a nuclear explosion in our region. 6.6, a rate of 6.6, which almost triple the replacement rate. And the replacement rate in development terms is, you know, if 2.1 people, well, over a long period of time, if each family has 2 kids, then more or less you're going to have a stable population. In the Arab world, over the past several decades, it was 6.6. So Oman, which was 400,000 people in 1970, is going to be about 5 million in 2020. Syria is interesting. 5.3 million in 63, they're about 20-some million now. 20-some million without any change within their governmental structure. So the population in the entire region is going to reach basically about 450 million by 2020. And this is the most interesting statistic for me. About 1 million new jobs are needed every year, or will be needed every year. This compared to the United States, which is about 1.5 million. The difference is the United States is about a $15 trillion economy, where the entire economy here is about a sixth or maybe a seventh of that. This is a major problem. People won't have jobs. In the meantime, the demographics aren't going to get any better. Why? Because for cultural reasons, and this was, by the way, the Syrian issue was very interesting because they started seeing that problem in the 1980s. So there was a very good book written by a guy that you guys might have heard of him, Patrick Steele, a political book, etc. But he was talking, that was written at the end of the 1980s, he was talking about the policies the Syrian government was trying to tackle when it comes to the population size, back in the 1980s. They couldn't. Why? Cultural reasons. So, this coupled with things like high urbanization rates, because at the end of the day, much of the region is desert, so they all live in very densely populated areas. So that means hospitals, that means water, that means a lot of things that are easy to manage within a very dense environment. So there's low infant mortality rate. People are not dying when they're babies, as in, for example, in Africa. Longer life expectancy, so they're going to live longer. Better health, better sanitation, etc. So the social dynamics are not getting any better. Social dynamics are going to continue to pressure. And finally, the area that's very close to my heart, which is technology. Technology is a very interesting thing. I've been coming back to the region almost on an annual basis since, well, for the past decade in the very least. And there's three areas that I've noticed incredible changes. One is mass communication, satellite TV. The decoupling of TV from the region itself or from the country from which the content is being created is fascinating. For example, Al Jazeera could report about Tunisia, whereas Al Jazeera rarely reports on Qatar. But Al Jazeera can report very honestly about everybody else. So the criticism that Al Jazeera gets is, oh yeah, but you don't really report about Qatar. Nobody cares. But they get to know everything else going on. The same thing for Arabiya. The same thing for the Lebanese channels that have gone regional. So this decoupling meant that censorship has gone down when it comes to satellite TV. People are not afraid to report what they want. Sometimes governments start complaining. Still, they've been basically reporting. Telecom is another one. Some of the highest penetration rates in the world. Higher than the average worldwide. Actually, we were in 90-some% here in the Arab world, in the Arab region, whereas on average worldwide it's about 82%. We have higher, and it's actually projected to go up to 130%, which means every person is on average going to have more than one line, one mobile line. Texting, and what I refer to as the superstar syndrome, the ability to vote through your SMS. So they've been able to do that for a number of years. But you can vote for a singer or for a beauty pageant. Here in Lebanon, for example, we voted for beauty pageants for a while, but we can't vote for a president, or some of the others can't vote. In Syria and Jordan, very interesting. Millions voted for singers. And in fact, both countries competed in national campaigns to have their people vote. But they could not vote for their president. So there was only a matter of time until basically people wisened up. And thirdly, the internet. So we all know what's going on with Facebook. What's interesting about Facebook is the fact that it allowed anybody to become basically a digital press. So the cost of publishing something has gone down unbelievably. For you to open a blog costs time, minutes, hours, and all of a sudden you have a huge amount of potential audience that you could reach. So what happened with Wa'il Ghunim, who basically started We Are All Khalid Saeed, or Kullina Khalid Saeed, was this. That's another book that for anybody interested in this should pick up. Because he explains the story. These were young guys. They felt strongly about this issue. And so they started blogging and writing on Facebook. And what Facebook did, which was very interesting, was connect them with others. And they created things like flash mobs. But what technology did not do is guarantee that things happened in the real life. So there were, in and of itself, even though I'm a technologist and I'd love to claim credit that technology did it all, it's not enough. It was a great enabler. But at the end of the day, people had to show up in Tahrir Square. People had to show up. In fact, some of the first, he talks in some of his conversations about interviews about the first manifestations that happened in Egypt, and they weren't sure if people were going to actually show up, because they were doing everything in the virtual world, but they weren't sure that people were going to take that and do it in the real world. So when they started seeing people with black shirts, which was, I guess, their way of kind of like a flash mob kind of an environment, they loved it. And he had to come, and he was, another very interesting factor was that he did it all from outside of Egypt. One, and two, he did it anonymously. So there were many advantages to doing it over the internet that it could not have been done a mere decade ago. So censorship, what censorship? There is no censorship in the real sense of the word. Maybe on press and things like this. But in the general sense, there is no censorship anymore. with YouTube, anybody can upload from a video. So all of a sudden, you've got 1 million Egyptians walking the streets, and boom, they can film a truck ramming 10,000 people or whatever number of people and killing them. And at the nightly news, it makes it to CNN. All of a sudden, the U.S. government, European governments, whoever, are pressured not to support the Egyptian governments, etc., etc. This is really what's going on. So technology has become the great enabler, even though it's not the tell-all. How are we on time, Paul? Good? Good. So the Egyptian 2011 became called as the keyboard revolution, Facebook revolution, call it what you may. But really it was a geo-economic, fundamentally a geo-economic, a geo-social revolution, which was enabled through technology. Geopolitically, that it happened because Tunisia happened, perhaps, but it's a tougher sell. That it happened because Iraq happened 7 years earlier, doubt it. Some people might like to argue that point. So we get to the third point, which is why now, and what are the potential alternatives? So in the book, we cover things like change theories. We won't delve too much into that, but change theories essentially is why do things change? Why do systems or regimes change? So we delve into that kind of stuff. Won't delve into that, but the most important theory in which the book really alludes to is the dynamics theory. Dynamics theory comes from physics, which is basically thermodynamics. And the theory, to make it in very simple terms, what it says is that there's a lot of elements working together, and somehow this medley, this mix of all these factors, create a certain dynamics. Now the interesting thing with dynamics theory is you cannot reverse the dynamics unless you reverse every single element. So, if we look at the odds of reversal of the dynamics, we go into 4 areas. So, you've got the geopolitical. Geopolitical typically is a short-term thing. So the US is allied today with Saudi, tomorrow it might be allied with someone else. Geopolitics changes. The US president changes, maybe his policies change. Obama is a little bit less, maybe or he's more averse to war, maybe less than. Things change. So geopolitics tend to have more short-term, or they tend to be more short-term, and they have odds of reversal that are relatively high. Now let's look at geoeconomics and technology. When it comes to geoeconomics, if we look at factors such as human development, you can't educate the population overnight. You can't change a policy and for it to take into effect in a week, a month, or even a year. It takes several years. The same thing with things like competitiveness. You can't make a nation productive in 1 year or several months. You have to take time. The same thing with technology. If you deploy technology today, one of the things that a lot of people wonder about Syria proper is why has the government not been able to shut down everything that's coming out of Syria, for example? Well, I'll take it even a step further. Why hasn't China been able to do it? China, just a few days ago, was basically facing just the exact same issue. There was some huge issues occurring in China with some of the Politburo members that have are having some major problems. And all the news has come out on the web, not through the media. So if China can't deal with this, can we expect any regime in the region to deal with that? These dynamics are medium-term dynamics. They cannot be reversed easily. So even if all of a sudden a regime, and you see some regimes trying, for example, Saudi Arabia, the first things that they started doing right after these uprisings happened is they started ceding a lot of the money or a lot of, I guess, subsidies to the people. So can they sustain that over a long period of time? That's one of the questions. The problem with Syria is that they were lucky in the 1980s and they found oil. Right now this oil is running out. It was about a 20-year supply of oil. So there's a question mark there into some of the regimes being able to sustain. They could reverse or try to reverse geopolitical pushes, but could they reverse geo-economic and technological aspects of it? And the geosocial, well, this is the most fundamental of them all. You can't really change a culture very easily. It takes you hundreds, if not thousands of years to change a culture. You can't change demographics, short of having something like a plague or maybe a nuclear weapon explode or something like that. You can't change demographics. So, someone was the other day asking me a question, which is, well, you know what? With geopolitics, it's like you're hitting a brake. You're driving with a car and you just hit the brakes. Yes, you hit the brakes with geopolitics, but the car, based on these other dynamics, is still going. So what happens to a car that's still going full force and you hit the brakes? It spins out of control. And that's likely what's going to happen with nations that don't have the resources to be able to reverse all these dynamics. So it becomes inevitable. Change is inevitable. Okay? Then we get to the idea of why is it democracy? So one of the issues one question I faced recently, which is, okay, well, revolution is one thing, but moving it to democracy is a totally different thing. And they're right. But I looked in the book at the different possible outcomes. Chaos is one, right? That's what happened in Iraq in the early 2000s. There was chaos. Chaos is not a sustainable model. Somalia is not an example many Arab nations are going to follow. Theocracy. Unlike what many people think, theocracy has not been a common practice in Islam, not over the past thousands of years. You can look at most of the regimes. In the US press, they like to say the caliphate, and some of the people in neocons on the right, etc., they like to warn or scare people into thinking, oh, the caliphate is coming. Well, if they actually are looking at what the caliphate really meant, that was more constitutional than many of the regimes are right now. So we haven't had a lot of theocracy or theocratic experimentation in the region. And I'm not sure the region really wants to go that route. There might be some Islamic influence, to be sure. But are they going to go the Iran route? Interesting there, we looked at the case of Iraq. Why did Iraq not become a theocracy? They shared the same, or at least the majority, shared the same religion as Iran. They share a border, a huge border. They shared the influence. There was a lot of things that could have favored a theocracy in Iraq. Why didn't it happen? The US alone opposed it? I don't think that's alone. They could have still been a civil war. So there's more to it. So theocracy to me is not the tell-all, although there might be some experimentation. Autocratic resurgence, there's a very interesting concept there, which is entropy, which is the ability of regimes right now to be able to support the weight of their people. And we argue in the book that this no longer stands. Therefore, autocratic regimes being replaced from one autocrat to the other doesn't really make much of a difference. So he's not going to solve any of the people's problems, so why would it work? It's not going to work. Somebody might try, and Tunisia tried. Right before the current elections, they tried to pull a fast one on the people, and they tried to basically, say, okay, we've replaced the other guys. It didn't work. In Egypt, right now, with everything that's happening with the Tantawi, military side of the cupola, they're trying, but the people are opposing it. Why? Because the people know that this is not a solution to their basic problems. Liberalization. I wrote a piece a very long time ago which is called Pacing Change or Changing Pace. Some of the regimes in the Arab world, I don't necessarily think they're going to democratize, not in the short term. Guys like the UAE, they're doing a good job, relatively speaking. Qatar. I mean, why would they, all of the people, if they're getting everything they need and their government has already liberalized so extensively and they're doing a fairly good job, I don't see necessarily a need for it to happen, at least not in the short. And they have small populations and huge amounts of wealth. Whereas in other places where they've opposed or at least kind of like put brakes on liberalization, places like Jordan, Morocco, eventually this broke down. And you saw some of the two major liberalization pushes happening right now within the current existing systems are actually in Jordan and Morocco. So finally, I reached the conclusion that democracy is the only solution for all those other regimes that can't liberalize and don't have any other solution. It's not because it's right. It's not because I think so. It's not because the US thinks so. It's not because Europe thinks so. It's because it's the only solution to the underlying geo-economic, geo-social, etc. problems within the region. So there's going to be a replacement of the social contract that existed, which is basically the regime saying to the people, we're going to protect you, and we're going to give you welfare, but you give us your self-determination. The 99.999% vote, right? That's going. Because they can't anymore offer that, the regimes. That's going to be replaced with, okay, well, the regimes are going to pull back and they're going to say, we can't offer you this. So this is your self-determination. You be self-sufficient. You figure it out. And that's what's going to happen. It's got to happen. There's no other solution that's possible. At least that's what's argued. So what's going to happen going forward? Going forward, there are several scenarios that might happen. Geopolitically, there might be some ups and downs. There might be some counter-revolutionary reverberations. There might be some attempts by some to kind of kidnap a certain revolution. There might be some Islamic experimentation. I don't necessarily see this as negative, and in the book there's a whole chapter dedicated to that. I think it's going to happen. It's got to happen. Geosocially, populations will continue to grow. Interestingly, women are probably going to get more and more of a role. And I think this is a good thing. But from a negative perspective, the Arab world is going to have to deal with the issue of the women entering the workforce and the unemployment. So there's this balance that's going to need to be played. But it's a good thing in the long term. So a lot of these expat communities that are currently working in the region and kind of sucking the resources, not in a necessarily negative way, but just naturally out of these economies, this is going to have to reduce and perhaps be replaced with women as being part of the workforce and a more productive male workforce as well. Technologically, full speed ahead on. There's no reason to believe. There used to be a lag whenever I would travel to certain lesser developed nations around the world, Asia, Latin America, etc. There used to be a lag of about 2 to 3 years in technology, no more. This region is pretty much as up to date on technology as anybody else. You've got the iPads, you've got the iPods, you've got the Macs, you've got the PCs, you've got Facebook, you've got everything. So there's no reason to believe that that's going to stop. We can't turn a nation all of a sudden into a North Korea. It's not going to happen. Geoeconomically, it's going to be very interesting. Some people think that it's all going to be rosy. It's not. And we look at certain other scenarios. We looked at different regions around the world. Eastern Europe and Latin America is a very interesting example. Latin America took it about 10 to 15 years, and I lived in South America for about close to a decade in the 1990s, right after what they called or termed the apertura, which was basically the economic opening. It took them a good 10 years to readjust their economies. And I'm not saying some macroeconomic kind of finance minister kind of a policy. I'm saying at the bottom level, becoming competitive. So that anything being imported, which is obviously, when you liberalize your economy, you start getting stuff from the outside, has to be able to compete with stuff on the inside. That takes a long time. So fiscal pressures cause governments to make serious cuts, and employment is going to abate. So Egypt is going to have to fire people from the government, unless they're going to subsidize them and get money from the outside. I think it's something that's going to be inevitable. And they're going to hope that a lot of the private businesses take over some of this employment. Things like high levels of employment and migration, or high levels of unemployment might cause migration, brain drain. You saw that a little bit in Tunisia. The first few weeks after the government basically fell, the Ben Ali government, you saw about 4,000 youth migrating, they were reported, migrating to Italy. More, or as importantly as this capital flight might happen. So you might see a lot of capital from particularly the oligarchs or the clique of the old regimes. They might skip town with all their money. So that also hurts the economy. So an economic transformation might take between a decade and a couple of decades. So it's a long or a medium term at least project. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. So what are the policy implications going forward? Well, one is to oppose it. And some regimes, we all know, are opposing it. Bahrain, Syria, Libya for a while. That causes civil strife. Radicalization is the potential. Militarization, which is what happened in Iraq. Economic meltdown. These economies were teetering on the brink to begin with. They were not productive, and etc. So as opposed to, some people like to give the case of Chile. Chile is a very interesting place. Chile under Pinochet, when they were basically when they became democratic, they had already had 10 to 15 years of liberalization before they became democratic. So their economy did not fall off the cliff. None of these economies, or at least few of them, actually had liberalized, except the crucial states, UAE, etc. Left unattended, just forget about it. Some in the West, I was actually in a symposium not too long ago, and there was one professor that came out and said, you know what, America has tried its best, we failed in the region, let's get out. That was his point of view. It's a dream. America, Europe, the developed world cannot skip. They have too much interest in the region, and the region has too much interest in them. Soft power, hard power, all kinds. So they cannot just skip. So what we recommend as part of the book is we looked at some cases that happened internationally, but also the case of Tunisia. So geoeconomically, what we see are very positive elements right now. Things like Mediterranean integration. I was recently in Marseille, and there's a World Bank office there, and they're doing a lot of work around the integration of economies around the Mediterranean. So that essentially gets a lot of the North African nations, and it gets some of the Levant. That's a good thing, because they can benefit and they can get closer economically to some of the Southern European nations. Pan-Arab market integration, you're seeing that in the Maghreb. Under Gaddafi, Libya never wanted to be part of that. One of the first things that Libya did, right after the government of Gaddafi fell, was they basically came and they announced to Morocco and to Algeria, can we work with you guys in an integrated market? That's a good thing. Trade agreements, things like US and Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, those should help. Entrepreneurship initiatives, a lot of those are coming out. Geosocial support, education, 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 education. Very interesting to see Wa'il Ghanim, the guy that was behind the Facebook page in Egypt. He basically left Google now a few months ago, and he's starting his education NGO in Egypt. That's a great thing. There has to be a lot more of that happening. Development, continuing along the development route, but over a long term. Human rights support, especially for women. And geopolitical. This is very interesting. We need the support of friends. We need them to believe in what we're doing. So things like institutional and democratic support, what Europe is doing in Tunisia, is a very positive thing. They immediately dedicated resources to help them with their democratic elections. They dedicated resources with money for economic support, etc. Safety nets. Well, in the case of Libya, obviously it was bombings, etc. Hopefully it doesn't reach to that level, but in some cases it may. In other cases, it's lack of military support, which was the case of Egypt. So they refused to support the Egyptian regime and preferred to kind of step back. That's also a positive thing. And some kind of a doctrine to support the democratizing nations in the region. So in conclusion, I'm very optimistic, but it's going to take a while. And in the words of a very wise Arab that lived a long time ago, but for any of you fans of Adam Smith, I'm actually a big fan of both. Ibn Khaldun, who came about 400 years before Adam Smith. He goes, throughout history, many nations have suffered a physical defeat, but that has never marked the end of a nation. But when a nation has become the victim of a psychological defeat, then that marks the end of a nation. And I think this Palestinian youth said it well. And that she was a Palestinian youth, I thought was very interesting. Because how desperate are some regions, right? In 2011, she said, Arabs across the region demanded a better future. Their courage must be complemented by commitment and concerted action from the global community to help secure that future. This is our challenge, and this is our opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Excellent.